this is not getting any better, right, over time. And 63 is not really coincidentally, but when the Civil Rights Acts start to be passed, right? So whatever effect they've had, they haven't fixed this. So these numbers are bad. So how did we get there, right? And how did we get out? Time out for just a minute, right? In the materials I gave you, it's not by being frugal, right? White people at every income level spend about 30% more than black people making the same amount of money, right? So let me start with the Freedman savings banks. So we're going to go back in history, right, to trace some of this stuff. Let me just remind you what banks do, right? Banks multiply money for society, and I am taking this account mostly from the work of Mira Baradaran, right? Banks multiply money. So you put all your money in the Bailey savings and loan, right? And the money doesn't stay there because they loan it out to other people, right? So they keep a little piece of it and they loan out 90% to the next person. The person who borrows that money, they're also making deposits, right? With some of them, they're not going to just spend it all at once, right? They're going to, or else the person that they pay, right, is going to put that money in the bank and deposit. And so then the bank's going to loan it out again. Right? Again, they'll keep a little bit, and maybe they'll loan out another 80% of it, right? That money gets sort of cycled through and used. So your $100 that you deposited is generating, right, $500 worth of economic activity because of the function of the bank in taking your deposits and lending it out to other people, right? And you'll recall that at the time of the Civil War, right, the promise was made about 40 acres and a mule. The promise was actually given out, but then had to be taken back, right, heartbreakingly, at least to some people. Of course, many people didn't get it at all, right? And what happened was at about the same time, there was a concern about what was going to happen to formerly enslaved people. Now, maybe they're not going to get the 40 acres, but and it was kind of a patronizing concern, right? It was oh, they're no longer going to have the guiding hand of an enslaver to tell them what to do. They're going to need to learn thrift and the discipline, right? Which is the side of capitalism that poor people get. So this bank, the Freedman Savings and Trust Company, became known as the Freedman Savings Bank, was chartered by the United States government at the same time as the Freedmen's Bureau, right? It looked safe. It had a lot of famous, well-respected people associated with it, although as it turns out, those people were not actually directors or trustees of the bank, right? But the odd thing was that what was offered to the freedmen were not at the kind of bank that multiplies money. This bank did not give out loans. This bank was offered just as a piggy bank, right? What was thought to be called for these newly emancipated former slaves was they just need to have a place that they can put their money and know that it'll be safe, right? And they can save up, right? So it was broadly advertised. Feel-good Republicans who wanted to help the freedmen, right, advertised it and trumpeted it and encouraged people to deposit their money, and then the newly freed slaves responded because they wanted nothing more than to accumulate the capital that it takes to participate in society, right? So they scraped up their savings and they deposited the money. Over the course of 10 years, they deposited $75 million, right, into the Freedmen's Bank. The bank grew. They built a fabulous headquarters building in Washington, D.C. They built there were 23 branches throughout the former Confederate states. They had renewed advertising campaigns. There were right slogans and sort of renewed campaigns. A couple of years later, sort of scoldings and admonishments to make sure that you save your money. Right? And the short story is that the Freedmen's Bank was not guaranteed by the federal government, although it might have appeared as though it were. It was not being run by these reputable people whose names were attached to it. In fact, it ended up being run by a person who had a lot of connections with a different bank from which he was trying to make money. And the charter of the Freedmen's Bureau allowed up to a third of the deposits to be invested in some way that was not defined. And it started with taking that depository money and investing it in risky railroad bonds. And then it escalated until at one point, at some point, the deposits in the Freedmen's Bank were just used as a slush fund for directors, right? This other bank, they dumped the risky loans of this other bank into this Freedmen's Bureau, and they took out the safe capital. At one point, it started to become clearer to Congress that there was something amiss. They tried to appoint Frederick Douglass, somebody with sort of impeccable integrity, right, to run the Freedmen's Savings Bank. And Frederick Douglass, in fact, came in thinking that this was going to be a good institution to support. Quickly discovered that there was rot at the core, and there was nothing to do but to convince Congress to shut it down, right? $75 million of the really scarce money that newly emancipated slaves scraped together, right, disappeared. And it's not just the money, it's trusting banks, right, that was destroyed, right? That's the sad story. You know some of the rest of the story that we've gone through, right? You know that the market for advancing yourself was in fact not free for Black people, that whole categories of opportunities to work, earn money. We haven't talked about this part yet, but invest and use banks were foreclosed to them, right? You know that sort of sharecropping arises at this time as a form of virtual peonage, right? But you know what? In the early part of the 20th century, Black banks tried again. Pillars of the community understood the importance of having a bank that would serve the Black community. Those banks had very little resiliency because they didn't have access to what makes banks resilient, which is networks of other banks, right? Because what banks do is they lend each other money, right? When there's a shortfall, right? And as a group, if they can all rely on each other, right, that helps them to survive. But white banks were not interested in making those partnerships with the Black banks. So many of these other efforts to have Black banking also failed, right? You know, I don't want to overstate this. Banking as a whole was less reliable, right, before the federal government came in and decided to insure deposits, right, and to regulate banks. So it's not as though white banks didn't fail as well, right? But looking at sort of how Black people were able to accumulate capital, which would be the basis for wealth sort of moving forward, right? The banking system was not where it was going to happen, right? And you know, before I continue, don't let me forget about just to remind you that what we talked about before is to just mention the violence, right? Just to recall that there were many places and times in which if a Black person was too successful in business so that they might be seen or perceived to be uppity, right? That those businesses often suffered violence and destruction, right? So our basic question that we're still sort of building up here is, you know, how do you accumulate wealth, right? What were the opportunities that might have come through all these years? And I'm just going to start with this general overview that, you know, one way to accumulate wealth is by making money. And so what are your general opportunities to participate? And we've gone over some of this before. We know, right, that by the time we get to some of the New Deal programs in the 1930s, Social Security, we've talked about this before, 60% of Black people were engaged in agricultural or domestic work that was not covered by Social Security, at least at the outset, right? They did fix these things later, but right, wage and hour laws that help sort of raise the standard of living, not applicable to agricultural or domestic workers, labor organization, right? There's a long history of the extent to which labor unions were discriminatory and right, and you know, some of them were more and some of them were less, but the labor's statutes were not just generally available to many of the occupations that Black people were employed in for collective bargaining. We've talked about the Farm Bureau, the GI Bill, administered through local offices, which throughout the South, where most Black people lived, right, did not make those programs readily available. So just as a brief stopping point to remind us that we've talked about this stuff before, these avenues of acquiring wealth, right, through income, right, not entirely cut off, but suppressed, right? What we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about